In this episode of the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast, we are going to be linking two of the things that I absolutely love, and that is circadian and quantum biology with metabolic health. We're going to start merging these concepts so you can see where they overlap, and I am so excited to welcome my guest today, Dr. Max Gulhane. He is a practicing medicine doctor down in Australia, and he is also a decentralized health educator, and he is phenomenal at explaining these concepts. So if you're anything like me, you might be really interested in all this stuff that I'm talking about, like light and circadian rhythms and electrons, but it's also a little confusing, right? And so for me, it doesn't stick right away. So I'm loving learning this information from multiple different speakers, hearing it said in different ways, because it's helping me to wrap my mind around these really difficult to understand concepts, but also importantly, get these takeaways of what this looks like, what this quantum biology looks like in my everyday life. So the cool thing is that so many of these strategies are actually free. They are free and they're accessible to people, and they're not something we have to be perfect with. And I think, and a lot of you have told me on Instagram that you feel this way as well, it feels really freeing to learn this information, because I think so many of us have been so stuck on, I have to get my diet right, I have to eat this right, and this gram of carbs, and we're tracking every macro, like every calorie that goes in our body. And that feels stressful to me. Like it just does. And we're going to talk about one of the coolest things that I think that incorporating these circadian practices does for us, and that is that it gives us a little bit more leeway with how we live, because it's increasing our vitality, it's increasing our resiliency, because it is really deeply from us beyond, below even a cellular level, from the atomics particle level, we are improving our health. So we can improve our health down on this microscopic level. And that is really making these huge changes in every aspect of our physiology. So I just wanted to share that if you're like, I'm not sure about this light thing. Well, one of my clients, she's one of my members. She did blood sugar mastery, and we're still working together, and she's in my membership, and she's at this like optimization stage, and she is the one thing that she is struggling with is that we've not been able to bring down her high morning fasting blood sugar numbers. And so we were having her do some fasts, because you can do, things I've learned about from other practitioners, from, studies and things, that it's like, oh, okay, we have to do this type of fasting. And she was doing these prolonged fasts, and she was doing some protein sparing modified fasting. And it's like kind of intense, and it wasn't helping. And I'm just like, I feel like it shouldn't be this hard. It just shouldn't be this hard for the body to regulate. And so I don't know what that looked like, but all of a sudden I'm learning about all this circadian biology, and we started having her, she really embraced all these circadian practices. She lives in an apartment. She went to the roof to get better access to the sunlight. She's prioritizing UVA light. She's blocking blue light at night. She's doing all the things that I teach about. And in a couple of weeks, her fasting blood sugar went down from like 103 to 83. 83. I mean, I posted this on Instagram. I mean, it's just unbelievable how these practices are impacting blood sugar numbers, insulin numbers, metabolic health. So if you're struggling to see that connection, you are going to learn about it in today's episode, because we talk a lot about eating, seasonal eating, the importance of ketogenic diets, and all sorts of things. We're going to dive into the food, but we're also going to talk about a lot of other things that can feel really disconnected to metabolic health and blood sugar, because they're different from what I normally talk about. But there is a direct connection, and I just encourage you to listen with an open mind and try on some of these things for yourself. You don't have to, but if you are willing, feel free to try these on. And if you need support through this process, That is where Blood Sugar Mastery comes in. I'm opening the doors for enrollment once again for the 20th round. And this program, this round starts May 5th. So if you're interested, just send me a message over on Instagram. You can email me, Danny@DanielleHamiltonHealth.com, and we will get you set up for a free phone call with me to see if this program is right for you. I have incorporated all of these circadian learnings into Blood Sugar Mastery. They are now the foundational module in Blood Sugar Mastery. So I'm not taking away stuff that I used to teach. Now we just have a different foundation. We have this as the lifestyle piece of what's driving the timing, what's driving what we need to be doing and why. And it really helps with prioritizing what we should focus on first. So that's enough for me. I'm super excited to bring on Dr. Max. You can find him at drmaxgulhane.com. He has an amazing podcast. His Instagram is Dr_Max_Gulhane. I will just link all of his stuff in the show notes below. Please be sure to follow him, subscribe to the show, like, rate, comment, review, share on your socials. It really means so much to me, and I am so thankful for each and every one of you listening. Enough from me. Let's welcome Dr. Max. All right, Dr. Max Gulhane, I'm so excited to have you on the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Danielle, for having me on.
Yeah, so we were just talking offline, and you are a practicing medical doctor, and I talk shit about medical doctors, and I don't feel like you fit into this category of the people who my message is sort of directed at, and I apologize for, for what I say about perhaps some of your colleagues, but you are very different probably than most. So I'd love to hear how you sort of fell into this knowledge that you have of circadian rhythm, metabolism, light, and all of those things.
Yeah, no, it's a fair comment because most of the time that my colleagues or the general mainstream medical profession have any interest in blood sugar or blood glucose level is usually when they're making a frank diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, which is when and I know when the train has well and truly left the station. So my approach or my insight into this whole field of what I like to think of preventative health, but it's really on a spectrum of health optimization. They're kind of one and the same, and they all blend in together. But my entry point was my own journey with acne, and going through medical school and a science degree, and learning all the theoretical knowledge around biochemistry, biophysiology, and medical science. None of it gave me any kind of insight or solution to my own problem, which I thought was a little bit, it wasn't serving the point I thought of what I was there for, which is hopefully helping patients live healthier lives. So I had bad acne later in my life, in my 20s, and at the time I was existing in a pretty indoor environment, to be honest. Reflecting back now that with the knowledge that I have now, I was not getting a lot of sunlight. I was living inside. I was eating and when I was outside, I'd probably be putting sunscreen on. And I was eating a diet that was pretty rich in grains, processed grains, but not overly junk food. Like in Australia, we have a sporting culture, and people are encouraged to basically consume carb and sugar-rich foods as almost endorsed or encouraged by kind of narratives. Things like Milo, which is like a malt chocolate powder that you add to milk. Things like Wheat Bix, which in Australia are a cube of wheat flake. Things like Up and Go, which are basically a mixture of dairy and seed oil that are kind of paraded around as a great sport food, and obviously Gatorade, and I'm sure it's the same in the US. But essentially, we're encouraged to consume all these types of foods because we're active, because we're really, really physically working hard. But doing that and eating that type of those type of foods when I was doing a bit of cycling, I just was breaking out in horrendous acne. And it got to the stage where I had contact with the mainstream medical system, where I was prescribed different medications, And the whole time, no one was asking about my lifestyle or asking about the factors that I've learnt later are essentially the reason why I was suffering from poor skin. And those were the fact that I had a lower vitamin D level. I was eating food that was provoking gut permeability issues, and and my gut was permeable, and it was manifesting in me as acne. So that wasn't mentioned, even though I was seeing doctors, seeing dermatologists, and eventually got prescribed some quite heavy medications, things like oral antibiotics that we use for quite exotic infections, and a medication called isotretinoin or Accutane, Roaccutane, which many of your listeners might know of. You can really recognize people who are on Roaccutane because their lips are very dry and flaky. Yes. Their skin is very dry. Always putting kind of lip balm on, but it's not a nice drug at all. And any women who are on it have to be on birth control because it's very teratogenic or causing birth defects. So it's not a nice drug. And eventually I stopped it because I was having side effects, and found that going a low carb diet and then carnivore kind of solved all my symptoms. So that got me going down this rabbit hole of metabolic medicine, dietary therapy. At the same time, as I'd finished medical school and started to work as a junior doctor, and then discovered the work of Dr. Jack Kruse and really fitting in the light and circadian rhythm stuff into this paradigm of holistic health. And I've always been kind of asking more and more questions because to me, I want to get as most complete as possible picture of what exactly is going on in the body so we can troubleshoot when things go wrong. And that, I think, is the issue with circling back to the start of our conversation, which is why it seems like a lot of medical care today is misplaced, is because I think fundamentally the siloed approach to the body, where you have specialists each kind of medicating their own organ. The cardiologists medicate the heart, the neurologists are only medicating the brain, kidney specialists, the nephrologists are medicating the kidneys. Everyone's looking in a siloed way, and without this whole body approach that is addressing the body as a whole and basically the mitochondria, the colony of mitochondria as a whole, then we're not really going to get, we're not going to be able to optimize health, and we're only going to ever get people from dying to surviving, and we're not going to help them get to thriving. So that's a bit about how I got to where I am now. And at the moment, I'm really encourage and speak about, advocate for circadian health and getting our light environment right, getting our food diet right. And those are kind of two of the biggest pillars that I think are personally contributing to people's sickness, disease, all these illnesses that they're suffering from. And if we can get those two critical pillars right, then my job as a general practitioner becomes obsoleted, or not totally, but I think a lot of the medical specialists become obsoleted because people solve and cure themselves before they need to have specialist attention.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love hearing your story. And it's interesting that, I'm sorry, this cat is, so I also struggled with acne. And that was one of the things, I struggled with it throughout high school, which was pretty, it was like, oh, of course you're going to do that. Of course you're going to have acne. You're a teenager. So I took a lot of antibiotics for it and everything like topical. My brother actually took Accutane. I never had to take that. But then I healed my whole body with all these other issues I had with a whole food paleo type diet. But then I had a really stressful year and started to develop all sorts of hormonal symptoms, and my acne came back, and it was so bad. It wasn't just like around my cycle. It was all over my forehead, all over my cheeks, cystic acne. Like, it was worse than it ever was when I was a teenager. And I was like, what the heck is happening? I had polycystic ovarian syndrome, but it was a ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting, circadian aligned intermittent fasting that I did that helped completely get rid of my acne. And it was unbelievable, that connection that I realized between, high insulin levels and acne. And so I definitely can relate to, to your story there. So You mentioned the word circadian health and circadian rhythms. So can we just start there? Can we break that down? So I use this term a lot, and I feel like I don't think my listeners know what this is. And so I think that would be a good place to sort of start to unravel.
Yeah, so the concept of circadian rhythm is this idea that our body has a timing mechanism, and it's a timing, a clock essentially, that is running our biology, and it's running very important bodily functions to do with when we're awake, when we're asleep, when we're supposed to be active, when we're supposed to be sleeping and repairing, when we're certain hormones are supposed to be secreted at what time, and it's a very finely tuned system that is reliant on basically a 24-hour clock, but it's not quite 24 hours. And why that's important is that it needs to be synced up. This clock in our brain, in a region of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, basically it needs to be synced up with external information. So our environmental information is helping to program and synchronize the clock in our brain through our eyes. And then through that and through other signals to do with things like temperature, meal timing, exercise activity, human interaction, social interaction, they're all timing clocks that exist in other parts of our body. So in all our metabolic organs, like our liver, pancreas, fat tissue, our gut, our skeletal muscle, they all have clocks in them too. And that they all rely on these clock timing mechanisms to make sure that they're making the right hormones, the right function at the correct time. The way that, or the reason why this evolved, and if you think about it very basically, is there's a massive difference in our environment from day and night, and obviously sunlight is the major determinant of that. The presence and absence of sunlight is an enormous impact on what is available in the environment, what we can do, what animals are say alert or asleep. So the circadian rhythm evolved at a very, very primitive stage, all the way back in bacteria and ancient bacteria and prokaryotic organisms, because it helped them adapt to this environment and anticipate the environmental change. So they knew, if you knew that nighttime was coming, then you could obviously put in place all kinds of hormonal and biochemical changes to make you more likely to survive. So the point that I really like to hammer home is that it's a very, very old, conserved part of biology. It's not like, this isn't something that's just tacked on the side of the system. The system is built around the circadian biology. And I think that's important, because when people in the health space and health optimization and holistic health, they give lip service to circadian rhythms. Respect your circadian rhythm, as if it's a side note, but mostly focus on the exercise and all this kind of thing. But if you look at the structure of how we evolved and how the cell works, how the mitochondria work, it's really built around the circadian regulation of all these bodily processes. And light impacts our biology not only through wake and sleepfulness, but also in metabolism. And one way of thinking about this is how, say, like a bear, a mammal, another mammal, it is responding to the environmental signals that it gets through its eyes and the temperature to respond to seasonal changes. So as the temperature drops and the daytime shortens, it's sending metabolic signals that are getting it ready for hibernation. It's getting it ready to put fat tissue on in response to what's going to be potentially a long winter. And everything that it's eating, it has to be congruent with the season, because if it's eating, and just like humans, if you're feeding it food that is incongruent with the season that it exists in, then it basically messes up this whole circadian timing system and the seasonal rhythm as well, as is received by things like the gut, the liver, in addition to what the signal is getting through the eyes. So the circadian system is a way of inputting information to allow the body, the mitochondria, and all your cells to operate the most efficiently as possible. So what that means in essentially is that we have to be very careful about these light signals that we're sending, and the skin and the eyes are going to be the two main ways of sensing these environmental signals. And not to go too deep, but your eyes are not only for vision. They're not only to show you the car in front of you or the tree in front of you. They also have cells in them and that respond to different light wavelengths. And that is essentially how this circadian system works in the eye, is that the eye responds to the presence or absence of blue wavelength light, particularly. There's others, but that is the main signal to say whether we should be awake or not. And that regulates a hormone called melatonin, which a lot of people might know is useful in helping us go to sleep, and they might take it as a supplement form. But we make that in our body in a range of different organs and contexts. But the signal to make it in the pineal gland that essentially kicks off the whole sleep rest phase is the absence of blue wavelength light. And again, if we're thinking about this on a really basic level, that makes sense, because when you're outside at midday, there's the most amount of blue light compared to the other light wavelengths. Whereas towards the evening and the nighttime, there's no blue wavelength light. So the body knows, if you're giving it the right signal, it knows when to go to sleep, when to be active, when to go hunting, when to be gathering, when to be relaxing and winding down. The problem, and we can talk about maybe this specifically or wherever you want to take it, but the problem here for your listeners is that we're simulating midday all the time by our exposure to artificial light and to down lights in our kitchen, in our houses, in our offices, our devices. That is a problem because we're essentially putting a massive spanner or in the works of our circadian timing mechanism. We've got a finely tuned Swiss watch, and we're shoving toothpicks in it, and that's a problem. That's a problem on a massive number of areas, and I think it's a major contributor to why people are getting insulin resistant, why they're getting obese, why they're getting cancer, why they're getting autoimmune disease and neurodegenerative disease and autism. All these diseases that have a origin in mitochondrial function are going to be impacted when our circadian rhythm is disturbed. So it's a critical facet of health, and that's why I urge people to think about their light environment first.
Yeah, that was great. That's phenomenal. So just to recap what you said, and let me know if I get anything wrong here. The environment that we're in, especially our light, but also meal timing, temperature, and some other things, really tell our body what to do at what time. And this is critically important because we're better at doing certain things at certain times of the day. And we need to do the right thing at the right time. Our body needs the correct stimulus from the outside, and that this is the foundation upon which we should plan our meals. We should plan our exercise. We should plan our day as opposed to the other way around, because this can help set us up for better melatonin production, which is an important antioxidant and obviously important for sleep. And so getting great sleep is the foundation for all optimal health as well. It helps our insulin sensitivity and all sorts of things. And so our light environment, and you mentioned these blue wavelengths of light, that we're getting too much blue light when it wouldn't naturally be outside. So what is outside is always what we want to try to mimic, because outside is always correct, right? So whether it's cloudy, whether it's, like snowy or stormy or whatever it is, it's always the right information that your body needs to know what to do. And so our days are definitely too dim as well, because we're inside and sometimes not getting the right, maybe it's bright for nighttime, but it's also not as bright as outside, right? So we're not getting that high stimulus, and we're having all these artificial light bulbs that aren't the right wavelengths of light. So it's messing us up and leading to a lot of dysfunction. And you mentioned, for my audience, especially this insulin resistant component, that it can drive insulin resistance. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about that concept. And then you also talked about mitochondria. And so how does the mitochondria come into play? Can you explain that for someone who's maybe never heard the word mitochondria, except for maybe in a 7th grade science class?
Yeah, no, it's a great summary, and what you described is correct. So the circadian rhythm, and this is another key point for people to take away, is that it's essentially think about a yin and yang. So when you look at a yin and yang symbol, you have a perfectly balanced and symmetrical light and dark. So not only do we need the right light source during the day and the right light source signal during the day, but we also need complete absence of light at night. So it's one thing to be outside during the day and getting all that really important full spectrum sun in your eyes and skin, but you can also come off the rails if your night times are too bright and they're not dark enough. So think about whenever we're talking about circadian biology and circadian rhythms for your listeners, think about the yin and yang symbol, and you need to respect that duality, the coupled system, and whatever is appropriate for your season. And that's another point, because if you're living at a higher latitude, then during the summer you're going to have a lot more daylight than nighttime. But then conversely, in winter you're going to have a lot more nighttime hours relative to the summer and compared to daylight. So if you're living at a higher latitude, then it's more difficult essentially to thrive and to respect your circadian biology, because nature is demanding you to to see that sunrise, see that sunset, no matter what time of year it is. And it's demanding you to be exposed to the temperature changes and the environmental temperature of your area, regardless of where you are. So that's a point for people to think about, which is if they find themselves becoming overweight or having dysregulated eating, becoming insulin resistant, living at a higher latitude where they really need to think about their light and temperature environment. And if they're tricking their body into thinking it's summer in Mexico while they live in Minnesota in the winter, then this is a really, really important problem. And the implication is that it's just much more difficult to respect our circadian biology when we're sitting in a temperature controlled, heated house in the wintertime. The light regulates, and again make the point, the light is influencing, and circadian regulation of our genes is 70% of the genome, which is kind of an estimate. And in 2017, there was a Nobel Prize won for determining the mechanism of how these clock genes, essentially in almost all the cells, are regulating how or the different function of the cells. So that's how important it is. So the next question is, okay, what evidence is there that this is? It sounds correct, but tell us more about the evidence behind it. Well, I think it's really interesting when you look at if you have mouse models and they mutate the genes that are involved in this circadian timing mechanism, and they knock out these clock genes, the mice become, and they have the same access to food, the mice become obese. So and insulin resistant and with visceral fat and all these kind of hallmarks of human metabolic diseases. So you can essentially cause that same problem by disrupting your own circadian rhythm with the wrong light signals. So another interesting information is that people who they've done long-term epidemiological studies on people who do shift work and have disturbed circadian rhythm by working late shift work, or having even separate studies with artificial light exposure at night, and their likelihood of developing diabetes, metabolic disease, obesity, heart disease is significantly higher. So it just goes to show that it's not only in mice, it's in humans too, which is if your light environment isn't correct, you're setting yourself up for these problems of dysregulated blood sugar, leptin resistance, and insulin resistance. So the question then is, how is that happening? And it comes back to these clocks that we have in our different metabolic tissues. So if you just imagine that the gut is expecting by regulated circadian rhythm, it's expecting to have nutrients during the daytime, because that's when you would have been hunting, that's when you would have been picking the berries, say if it were in spring or summertime. If you're putting food in the gut at 10 p.m. at night, 11 p.m. at night, and when the signal is incongruent with what's the body is expecting, then that is going to cause dyssynchrony or uncoupling of the clock in the gut from the clock in the brain, which is that master clock. And that dysfunction is therefore contributing to basically putting on weight, reducing the insulin sensitivity of things like your fat cells, like your liver. So the insulin sensitivity, or our body's ability to deal with blood glucose after we eat a meal, is impacted depending on the time of the day. And if you think about, say, waking up in the morning and you go outside, your body has a natural amount of cortisol that it secretes, and that's to make you feel wakeful, that's to get the day started. And naturally your blood glucose kind of can rise, and that's obviously the dawn phenomenon that we see sometimes. But if you're dysregulating your circadian system by seeing isolated blue light really early before the sun rises, you can essentially exacerbate or prolong that cortisol spike, which is going to again make it more difficult for that blood sugar to come down appropriately. And there's lots of other mechanisms, but essentially the light environment that we're in is influencing the way the body's dealing with the sugar spike of the food. And we can either increase or decrease the degree to which our blood sugar rises based on the light environment that we're eating that food in. And that is something that not a lot of people are talking about.
Yeah, I always say when the sun goes down, insulin clocks out, because if I use a lot of CGMs and I notice that my insulin sensitivity, so my blood sugar response to foods, let's say, is much better earlier in the day, and it gradually gets worse throughout the day. And that's because I have a very dialed in circadian rhythm, and other people will say, oh no, mine is better in the evening. And then these are people oftentimes who are like sleeping in till 11 a.m. or something like that. And so their body is just a little bit off, and I wouldn't say a little bit off, quite off. And so can you explain a little bit more about how this is happening with that regulation of blood sugar with the light?
Yeah, and there was a really interesting paper that was done recently by Glenn Jeffrey, who is, I believe he's a neuroscientist in the UK, but he essentially he had two groups of people, and he both gave them the glucose tolerance test. So maybe your listeners might know about it. It's one way of diagnosing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. But he gave two groups of people this glucose tolerance test, and he exposed one to red light in form of a red light panel for, it wasn't very long. I think it was maybe 20 minutes at quite a low dose. And what he found was that there was significantly lower blood glucose as measured on this oral glucose tolerance test in the group that were exposed to the red light. So essentially, that was one mechanism of showing that the light is actually improving or increasing the body's ability to deal with glucose through mitochondrial function. So it's increasing mitochondrial respiration, and that basically means that your body's energy-making apparatus are these tiny little ancient bacteria in all your cells, and they work essentially they work like a colony. And even though they're in all these separate cells, but they take inputs, they take food inputs, they take light inputs, they take temperature inputs, and they essentially are burning fuel to make energy. And if you're inputting the wrong fuel in, then you can mess them up. And that is, say, if you eat processed carbohydrates like and seed oils and sugar, it's like putting an ethanol fuel in the Ferrari engine. So that's not a good thing. So you can obviously derail the system or reduce the efficiency of the engine by putting the wrong fuel in. But if you don't have the right cooling or the right lubrication, then the engine's also going to break. So one way to think about the light is that this is like the lubrication for the engine. So the red light was able to reduce the blood glucose. So it's like improving the efficiency and the lubrication of the engines. And then cooling, that's something called melatonin that gets made not only in the pineal gland during the nighttime in the absence of blue wavelength light, but it also gets made during the day on exposure to near infrared light, which makes up almost half of the light spectrum that is, we can't even see it. So what that means is that the mitochondrial engines need to be tuned properly. When they stop, when they work inefficiently, then that manifests as visceral fat around the abdomen. It manifests as insulin resistance. It manifests as diabetes eventually and high blood glucose. So the challenge for everyone who's trying to get their blood glucose under control is essentially, how do I run my mitochondrial engines as efficiently as possible? And putting the highest octane fuel in them is only one part of the story, because anyone who's driven a car, and apologies for your listeners if they're not familiar with engine analogies, but anyone who's driven a car realizes that you won't get very far if you don't have any oil or lubrication. So yes, the fuel is important, and yes, what you're eating is important, not diminishing that, but the context of which those mitochondria are existing in with respect to the temperature and the light are very, very important, and to a certain degree can offset a poorer quality fuel. And some of your listeners might have heard of Dr. Jack Kruse, but he's kind of famous for saying that if you are living on the equator with a completely dialed circadian rhythm and you're getting a whole bunch of sunlight during the day and an absolute pristine night free of any light, artificial light, you're not exposed to things like non-native electromagnetic fields, which are a form of non-visible light, then you can eat, so to speak, shit on a shingle and you can still be okay. And it's kind of a hyperbolic and a little bit of an exaggerated statement, but I do agree that if our light environment is optimized, we've got a bit more latitude to tolerate deviations in the diet. Not advocating for it, but the converse is also true, and that's what I think is more interesting, which is if our light environment is really broken, so we're looking at an iPhone from 6 a.m. all the way till 11 p.m. at night, and we're sitting in completely disconnected from our temperature and seasonal environment, we're eating bananas and it's winter in Minnesota, then you have so little latitude to deviate from a really, really low carb, ketogenic, carnivore type diet without falling in a heap. So that's a really great way to become diabetic, become overweight, to become insulin resistant and get autoimmune disease, is if you eat those bananas in the middle of winter with a disturbed light environment, because the disconnect between what your biology needs and what you're giving it is so great that it's causing this profound mitochondrial dysfunction, which can manifest depending on which organ kind of breaks first, whether that's your immune system and it starts responding to, starts chasing ghosts and you develop MS, or it manifests in your pancreas and liver and you get insulin resistant, or it manifests in your in another organ and you can get cancer. I mean, so
in your brain you can get anxiety and depression and
exactly,
all sorts of
exactly.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a key point, and why I really emphasize the environment. It's not only the input into the mitochondria, it's not only the fuel, but it's the environment which they're existing in that's so important.
Yeah, that is so important. And I made a post about, hey, a banana's probably going to spike the shit out of your blood sugar, and even more so if it's, if you're eating it in the middle of winter in Chicago or something. And, people obviously push back because they just don't understand this mechanism that's happening. So can you explain a little bit more about, I believe there was studies showing that the UV light, when it's higher, when it touches the skin, it impacts the gut microbiome, helping it to break down simple sugars better. Is that right?
Yeah. That's a great question. So if you think about what's happening in summer, then especially say somewhere in the equator, is that there's a presence of UVB light. So to explain it really simply, what we get on planet Earth, or what our body is expecting, is going to be a mixture of visible and non-visible light. So there's what's called a electromagnetic spectrum of and basically it gives you an idea of the type of light that we need. And the very short wavelength light is ultraviolet, and ultraviolet people are aware of because ultraviolet light is needed to make a very important hormone, vitamin D, in our skin, and it's also very important to make a compound called POMC, which essentially is a master coordinator hormone of almost everything. It regulates regulates mood through something called beta endorphin. It regulates the immune system function. It regulates glycemia and metabolism. It regulates the stress response. So it's a really, really old, very important pro-hormone, because it gets cut up in all types of different hormones. But that gets released when we have UV light. So that's why UV is so important to health, and we can't exist without a healthy amount of UV. The point about UV is that depending on your latitude, you actually lose UV B during the wintertime. And that is to do with the angle of the sun and the atmosphere. But it means that, again, coming back to this idea about how you have to be intentional if you live at high latitude, is that that's nature telling you that you need to be outside during the summer to build up those vitamin D stores when there's UV light around, and then be inside and respect the darkness, so to speak, during winter. But the UV light and the presence of UV light means that is going to be congruent with what is growing. So think about there's never going to be the pineapple or the banana available in your environment if there's no UV light around, because it would be winter and the plant can't grow at that latitude, at that temperature. And so essentially that is one way of thinking about why we shouldn't be eating that banana during the winter, is because it can't grow there. And the presence of UV light, and this was a recent study done in mice, is that they exposed the mice group to the same diet, but same basically junk food, seed oil rich diet. But the mice group that got ultraviolet light were resistant to the effects of the diet. They were less insulin resistant, they were less obese, they were less metabolically sick, showing you that it's the light environment that is influencing how susceptible or not the endocrine system, the metabolism, the mitochondria are to the fattening effect of food. So that is kind of one way of thinking about it. But it's not only ultraviolet. We've also got visible light, which is going all the way from violet, cyan, blue, green, and then all the way up orange and red light. That is all visible light, and like we talked about before, the red light can help reduce blood glucose in that experiment that I just talked about. And then it's the blue light, and the blue light that is promoting cortisol by the way it affects POMC and it affects the body, is that it's causing cortisol to rise, and appropriately so, because when there's the most blue in the environment, then we need to be the most active. So that each of those visible light wavelengths is playing a role. And when you wake up in the morning, you get blue, but it's a lot of red and infrared. Midday is mostly blue, and obviously lots of UV, and then the kind of process reverses itself. But infrared light, which is non-visible, is always present. So that is another reason why we need to be outside. So I think of these light wavelengths as medicines, and each of them is like a different medicine that your body needs to take every day. And when you get outside, not only are you regulating your circadian rhythm and sending those signals that we were talking about earlier in the podcast, but you're also giving yourself the correct medicine that you need at the right time to make these hormones, to make all those pathways work. So that's just one way of thinking about it. But to, again, hammer home the point, you shouldn't be eating a banana in winter. And if you said to someone, hey, Danielle, I've got a great business idea. I'm going to grow bananas in New York in December, you get laughed out of the room. Yet the same person might not think twice about drinking a banana smoothie in winter. I mean, there's an obvious disconnect here. So if it doesn't grow at your season, at your latitude, then you definitely shouldn't eat it.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Great information. And so I have a feeling some people are thinking, okay, well, I thought that the sun was going to kill me and that I need to lather up in sunscreen every single time I go outside because I'm going to get skin cancer. And so I should protect myself from the sun. What do you say to those people?
That it's a very important point, and I think that this idea that the sun is harmful or kind of going to kill us is it's a half truth, but it's a very, very, very harmful half truth. And I think it's perhaps even just as, or maybe even more harmful than this idea that saturated fat and saturated animal fat and dietary cholesterol is harmful. And the reason why it's a half truth is because when scientists were first exploring light in the early 1800s and developing different treatment options and doing experiments, they managed to basically take ultraviolet light, which is one part of that natural sunlight spectrum, and they made a lamp that only emitted ultraviolet light. And when they shined that lamp on mice and rats, which are nocturnal mammals, they were able to induce skin cancer. But the problem with extrapolating that finding into humans is that whenever we get ultraviolet during the day, we're also getting that in the red, we're also getting that near infrared. So it's like purifying the fructose out of some kind of fruit,
out of an apple, something, yeah.
And then giving that to someone, and then telling us, and the person gets gout or gets PCOS, and then saying, well, it's the apple is the problem. Well, obviously not, because it was taken completely out of context. So right. The sun is critical to life and to health, and the effect is so great that there's a couple of recent studies in the past 10 years that managed to actually quantify how important sun exposure was. And they looked at women in Sweden who were exposed to sun and weren't exposed to sun. So those who deliberately went and sunbathed versus those that didn't. And they looked at a whole bunch of other factors, including whether they smoked or not. And what they found, and they controlled very well for what are known as confounding factors, or kind of other reasons why they might have found what they found. And the results of the study were that the women who were actively seeking sun had significantly lower all-cause mortality, meaning death from any reason, compared to those who avoided the sun. And the magnitude of that impact was equal to smoking. So the women who got in the sun and smoked had a similar mortality to the ones who avoided the sun and didn't smoke. That's how critical the sunlight is. And we could go through each organ system, but essentially the benefit that we get on our cardiovascular health, on all these other cancer causes of cancer, like blood cancers, like GI cancers, bowel cancers, colorectal cancers, all these, even skin cancers themselves, is actually significantly lower in those who got more UV and deliberate sun exposure. So even on a massive population level, there was slightly higher rates of developing skin cancer. Even those who got skin cancer lived longer than those who avoided the sun. So we have to take a really holistic view of health, to not focus only on, I got the risk of skin cancer. And again, it's not the reason why these skin cancer keeps rising in incidence is not because of the sunlight, it's because of the artificial light and these other kind of lifestyle factors that we're also doing. And we can talk about that. That's a separate issue. But essentially, we need to focus on the whole totality of the picture here. And those who seek out UV light and get more deliberate sun exposure live longer. It was not only the melanoma in southern Sweden study, it has been repeated recently by Professor Richard Weller with the UK Biobank study, and he basically worked that out in two different ways, both those who actively sought out UV and those who lived at lower latitude. So That was a massive study that is, it's unequivocal that those who get more UV light live longer. So to answer the concern of someone who's like, okay, well, should I get deliberate sun exposure, is yes, you have to be careful, especially if you're taking things like photosensitive medications, like the antibiotics that I discussed at the beginning of this interview, or like Roaccutane, or like an immunosuppressing medication, because the sun is like a stressor. It's a hormetic stressor, and your body's evolved to deal with it and to recover, especially if you're getting full spectrum sunlight. But you also have to respect the fact that if you're taking medications, or if you're under artificial light, if you've got a really pale skin type and you're living, in the middle of the equator, these are all reasons why we need to be more careful. But essentially, the more you live closer to the way, to use a cliche, nature intended, by exposing yourself during the day to a full spectrum sun, to eating within a local area, to avoiding artificial light and those non-native electromagnetic fields, the more likely you are to not put yourself at risk of developing skin cancers. So there's nuance here, but the data is unequivocal, which is that there's an all-cause mortality benefit from deliberate sun exposure.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I learned from Sarah Kleiner and Carrie Bennett that something about how UVA can help protect the skin from the UVB, or like that you're supposed to get UVA before you do that midday sun exposure. Is that right? Can you explain that for us and what UVA is?
Yeah, so there's this beautiful symphony, and we keep looking back at how we evolved, designed, however you want to think about it. But everything it's almost like the pieces are always in the right place if you respect nature and if you respect your biology. And what I mean by that is if you get out in the early morning, the early part of the morning, there is no UV light yet. There's a lot of infrared, there's a lot of red, and there's a bit of blue. What that effect of red light, it's not only able to lower your blood glucose, but it actually prepares the skin for the ultraviolet exposure later in the day. And it does this by increasing the collagen production in the skin. It does this by reducing reactive oxygen species. It's like preparing the system for what it knows is going to come next. So ultraviolet A comes after, depending on where you are. Ultraviolet A is the first ultraviolet light that you get, and then you get ultraviolet B. And yes, they can cause damage, and they can cause mutations to your DNA, but that again is fixed or basically mitigated by the red light that you're supposed to get from the sunset. So, which is going to happen if you're outside later in the day. So as the day begins and then wanes, when you're getting those light ingredients and those light foods in the right proportion based on the natural occurrence of these different light wavelengths, then you're essentially going to get what you need to prevent things like sunburn. And that is something that I've noticed personally, and with people I've worked with, is when you maximize that time in the morning of early morning sunlight before the UV light shows up, your ability to stay out without burning once the UV light shows up is immensely improved and immensely increased. So nature's given you as a packet. We've been given this toolkit, this natural toolkit, and if you respect it, you're going to benefit and you're going to derive these health benefits. But if you have a disrupted circadian rhythm, if you make refined seed oils rich in linoleic acid your main fatty acid, instead of a diet that's rich in long chain saturated fatty acids with beneficial omega-3s, if you block the UV light from your eyes and skin with sunscreens and sunglasses, if you fail to get that early morning red on your skin and in your eyes, then you're going to confuse the system, you're going to confuse your circadian biology, and you're going to set yourself up for sunburn and skin cancer, because you're using you're not using the system appropriately. You're not using your toolkit appropriately. So who's to blame here? Are we going to blame the sun or all those other factors that are going on?
I love it. I love that zooming out of like looking at the whole spectrum, the whole day of all the light, and that we need all the pieces of it. It's like a multivitamin, right? You don't we don't just want to take one vitamin. We need all the vitamins, right? So that's a it's a beautiful
I,
analogy and
Yeah,
visual.
and I
Yeah,
just
please.
want to make another point, which is I mentioned
Hmm.
that it's difficult to thrive if you are living at a higher latitude. It's even more difficult to thrive if you live at a higher latitude if your skin type is mismatched to that location. And what I mean by that
If
is
it's
that
darker, yeah.
everyone has got an amount of melanin based on their ancestry, and the melanin has a whole bunch of functions, but one of them is to absorb ultraviolet light and dissipate it as heat. So the more melanin you have, the more difficult it is to generate your vitamin D. So the harder it is to meet your needs, your nutrient needs from the sun, if you're a darker skin living at a higher latitude. And conversely, the more likely you are to develop something like a melanoma if you're as pale as a redhead, kind of living at in Kenya at 2,000 meters altitude. There's too much UV for your skin type. So that's obvious because if we look at who were the native people at the different lands that they existed, then they have the perfect amount of melanin for that latitude. So we also have to keep that in mind. And if you live in Australia, where I am, the melanoma capital of the world in Queensland, it's basically a sad constellation of all those problems that I talked about, in addition to people with really pale skin living in a really high UV yield area. So there's so many nuances here, and it's I'm glad we've got some time to talk about them, because if you go outside and just try and sit in the midday sun without doing everything that we talked about, you're going to end up in trouble. So that's some more nuance and more important information that I hope your listeners will take on board to, I guess, harness the benefits of deliberate sun exposure.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that. I actually made a post today talking about nuance and how important, like, the health is in the nuance. It's in the details. So we can't just be like, throw out your sunscreen. And like, it's like, wait, okay, maybe we want to, use some shade and use some different appropriate things to, but not sunglasses, but sometimes you might need them if the sun's right in your eyes and you're driving home in Florida, but ideally we want to take all of this in and look at these things. We have to be zooming out and learning from people like you about all these little nuances. So I'd love to just sort of jump back to food, and I know that you started carnivore. I did keto. And where do carbs fit in this whole circadian type lifestyle? So we know that we're not embracing these tropical fruits if we're living at higher latitudes, but do carbs have a place? Because I know that, again, bringing, like, let's talk nuance, because it's not as simple as, if you live in the equator, you can have carbs. If you don't live there, you can't have carbs. Like, where's the nuance?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think about it from the perspective of are you metabolically, are you sick, or are you not sick? And what I mean by that is, do you have insulin resistance, PCOS? Do you have fatty liver disease? Do you have diabetes, or do you have any kind of significant metabolic problem? If you do, then you're better off not consuming large amounts of carbohydrates, no matter what your latitude is. And because if you got to that point, you used up your carbohydrate intolerance, either by existing for too long under the wrong light, like the alien light, or by drinking your banana smoothie in the middle of winter. You've used up your tolerance, so you need to heal metabolically before you can reintroduce those carbs without exacerbating those underlying metabolic problems. So I think that's a really key point, because it's a different story for someone who is healthy. They're not overweight. They don't have visceral fat. They're just looking to optimize themselves. They have much more latitude to consume the carbs that are basically existing or growing where they are. I think that they can do that. Whether if that's honey, if that's maple syrup, sure, go ahead. You're not sick. But if you are metabolically sick, and if you are not respecting that light environment in the way that we talked about earlier, then you should avoid these foods and you should be eating a lower carbohydrate diet. Maybe you're only going to eat 20 grams of carbs once a day, and that's going to be in the middle of the day while the sun's out and you're outside grounded with the sun on your skin, getting that red light to help mitigate the glucose spike. That's the context, because if you try and do anything else, particularly if you're trying to eat overnight while you're doing shift work under the blue light, then you're going to come to grief. So that's the main nuance, which is, are you sick or are you not sick? Do you have metabolic disease? Do you have insulin or leptin resistance? If not, and let me just quickly define that, because I've talked about it a lot, but it helps if I make it more specific. So you gave us a great definition of insulin resistance before, but one way of defining that from a biochemical point of view is if you've had a fasting insulin level. So it's a blood test that gets taken, blood draw. If it's above, if we're being strict and if we're aiming for optimal health, I like to see it below 4 or below, and certainly below 6. Even though the reference ranges for this blood test are, can be under 20, but that's not really appropriate. So to understand if you're in the sick category is, are you insulin resistant? Is your fasting insulin above 6? Do you have type 2 diabetes? Have you been diagnosed with, do you have an HbA1c or glycated hemoglobin above 5.6? If that's you, then you're in this category.
I would even say even lower, like a 5.3 or 4 well. Like these are like the pre-diabetic.
Yes.
Right? Do you see that too?
Yeah. It's definitely appropriate to be strict. And obviously, so if you're insulin resistant or on that scale, then you're in the sick category. If you've got visceral fat, and a really simple way of measuring this is just taking your waist circumference, and it should be less than half your height. Ideally, probably 4.45. It shouldn't. Your waist shouldn't be more than that number, because you're at risk therefore of having fat in the wrong place. So that puts you in the sick category. So I would encourage everyone to really understand where they are, and if they've got a diagnosis of fatty liver or PCOS or diabetes, then you're already in that position. But understand whether you're sick or not, and then if you're not sick, then eat appropriately what's growing from a carbohydrate point of view, because it's going to be congruent with your light environment. And eating something like within 100 kilometers, if it's grown within 100 kilometers, that's a good idea. And I think that's a great heuristic to help people think about carb consumption that's seasonally appropriate.
Yeah, I do too. And I love that you're talking about ways to actually improve your metabolic health, and that idea that I just literally posted about this right before we jumped on here, that if you are metabolically unwell, you can't get around the fact, like there's no hacks you can do or anything, that you have to lower your carbs or like seriously reduce them. And so yes, you can sit outside and ground and eat, but you can't have apple cider vinegar and then expect like you're you need to lower the carbs, because nothing is erasing the carbs that we're putting in the system. And I think there's a lot of good information out there that is helping people understand the concept of blood sugar, but it's a little bit oversimplified, and it's not really taking into account the nuance and the people who are sick. So if you are listening to this podcast, you are likely in the 93% of at least Americans who are metabolically unhealthy, and that means you have to do a period of healing. And this is where a ketogenic carnivore style diet can be super, super helpful, because it's like we have to swing the pendulum the other way. We've been overindulging in carbs and terrible light and processed carbs. For me, I was doing paleo and I was doing all these healthy carbs, but they were inappropriate for my light environment. I was in New York at the time. It's the light story is also a whole other story that I'm now understanding on top of the story that I always, tell on my health journey. But anyway, we swung this pendulum so high in this way of carbs that we have to reverse it and go more extreme. It's not a lifestyle like, oh, I'm never going to eat a carb again. For most people, we can incorporate some carbohydrates again if we dial these things in and if they are appropriate for our latitude, for our light environment. And I think that's a huge missing piece of the puzzle. And that by dialing in our light environment, by getting all the exposure to these lights, blocking blue light at night, this doesn't mean you have to, by the way, like some people are like, well, I need to see in my house. We all need to see. So I talk about like amber or red lights, when the sun goes down, candlelight, and having them low on the ground. Like typically we would just have firelight as humans. And then as the fire burns down, that would be brighter and orange. And then as the fire burns down, we'd have the glowing red embers. So as it gets closer to bedtime, we want those red lights. We don't want bright lights in our eyes at that time. So that's how we can modify that night environment. But we can also incorporate these strategies to help improve our metabolic health so that we can better tolerate carbs, that we have better blood sugar responses to these foods. It's not just about like, hey, everybody avoid these forever and that's how you have to do it. It's like we want to be healing as well. So we want to talk about what happens after that. And I'm so glad you're bringing this up because it's been a topic on my mind lately. So
and a couple points is that I love it how you use continuous glucose monitors because everyone's individual and we can really use that as a tool to measure the impact of what we're doing. So I would challenge people, eat the same diet for a week, you go to your office under your blue light and blast yourself with blue light, and then do the same, but turn the blue lights off during the week and wear blue blockers. See what that does to your blood glucose level. And then try eating only during the day. Try and eating your last meal 4 hours before dinner, before bed, and see how your blood glucose is affected by these different interventions, these different strategies. The other point I'll make is that if we kind of circle back to what I said at the beginning of the conversation, which is it's the environment that your mitochondria are existing in that is so important. Well, there are other ways of helping you get your blood glucose under control, and we talked about red light. Obviously, exercise and walking after a meal is just such an easy thing to do. But cold exposure, and I talked to Thomas P. Seeger, who's a ice bath kind of expert and engineer, and he uses the ice bath to accelerate the process of getting into ketosis. So he can shrink the amount of time that he takes to become ketogenic by simply getting in the ice bath. And the reason for that is because there's certain type of fat tissue in our body called brown adipose tissue acts as basically a furnace. It's like a metabolic sink. It will suck these substrates, these unburnt fuels maybe, out of the tissue and burn it to keep you warm. And that's another way of thinking about how to improve your metabolic health and potentially to get you from that sick category to that healthy category as soon as possible. So that's I guess a key point that I want people to take away with, which is the mitochondria is what we need to get ourselves metabolically healthy again. And we can make them healthier by going from the poor quality fuel, which is the carb-rich diet, to more of a high-octane fuel, which is mostly fat and protein. But we can also improve that cooling and lubrication with our light environment, and we can also improve their efficiency with cold. So even walking outside without a shirt on or with only a t-shirt on in winter is one great way of helping to improve our mitochondrial function and therefore our metabolic health. So if we take a really holistic view and put yourself back into the environment, you will help to heal yourself from these metabolic problems.
I love that so much. Quick caveat about cold exposure. I have a lot of people who listen to my podcast or who follow me who have hypoglycemia. And if you are a person who struggles with low blood sugar and crashes, it's not appropriate for you yet because it's too much of a stressor and it will probably cause your blood sugar to tank. So any of these hormetic stressors, I have a lot of people with hypoglycemia who can't go in the sun. And so it's like if your body is too sick for the environment, we really need to look at what stress your body is under. It's like, can you get outside for sunrise? Can you be there when it's just the first, couple of hours of the day before that bright light and that heat comes in, what can you do to mitigate that artificial environment and lean more into nature? And that is, like you said, you gave us all these amazing healing strategies. I have a lot of people with hypoglycemia or reactive hypoglycemia who can't walk. They can't do any exercise. They can't even go to the mailbox. They can't shower without their blood sugar crashing from the heat. So I get a lot of these extreme cases. And so again, it's about lowering the stress on the system. And so we can do that by tapping into all those modalities that you just talked about. So super helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah, did you want to say something else?
It just means that you need to see someone who can help you through this process. And so see Danielle and get us some tailored advice, because you're right. We need, they're all tools. They're just simply different tools. And you need to use the right size spanner for the right size nut. You need to have someone to be able to guide you through and let you know which is going to be most appropriate for you at the right time. And obviously, if you're on insulin, if you're taking SGLT2 inhibitors or other kinds of diabetic medications, please do this in conjunction with your prescriber so that they can safely deprescribe the medications. That's a caveat that I probably should have made a bit earlier. But that to me, it goes without saying. If you're on a prescription medication, then this needs to be supervised. But the nuance of when to use which of these tools is going to lie with someone who has expertise. So work with someone to basically be guided through this process if you're in that sick category.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Where can we find you? Where can do you have any offers that you want to share about, any classes, courses, anything? Because you're obviously a wealth of knowledge, and I'd love to promote your work as well.
Thanks, Danielle. It's been a pleasure. So you can find me on my podcast is called Regenerative Health Podcast, and my YouTube, if you just type in Max Gulhane MD into YouTube, you'll find my YouTube channel. I've got basically an introduction into circadian health. So if you want to dive more into light, when to see light at the right time, when to eat, how to block blue light or how to mitigate our light environment, then I've got a introduction or a circadian reset course. And I also have a group where it's just a weekly Q&A and a monthly kind of subscription model where I help and just support people who are doing things like low carb and carnivore and circadian rhythms and cold exposure, and kind of piecing all these things together to get to optimal health. So that's what I'm offering, and I'm working on a solar callus or a deliberate sun exposure course to again go through some of those nuances about how to get sunlight exposure safely. So stay tuned. That should be dropping within the month. So thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. We will make sure to link everything in the show notes. I am working on my solar callus because I'm going to Costa Rica next month. And so I look forward to your course, and I'm so grateful and so thankful for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great. See ya.